Welcome everyone to the webinar on the Global Terrorism Index 2025, the Americas Lounge. My name is María José Maldonado. I am a research fellow at the Global Governance Institute and a key expert for the Mexican window at the EU's funded program of assistance to combat transnational organized crime in Latin America and the Caribbean. I'll be moderating today's session. I thank the Institute for Economics and Peace for the invitation to participate once again. It is an absolute pleasure to be here today. Before we begin, of course, I'd like to remind our audience that the GTI 2025 is fully available online, and I encourage you to go and check it out. Also, I'd like to encourage our audience to engage in the conversation by sending us all your questions and comments by using the tool of Q&A at the bottom of your screen. Moving on from that, today we mark the official launch of the 12th edition of the Global Terrorism Index in the Americas. For over a decade now, the Global Terrorism Index has been a leading and reputable resource to identify and understand the key trends and patterns in terrorism worldwide. Beyond that, the report measures the impact from terrorism and deep dives into emerging trends. An example that I'd like to highlight is how the GTI highlights the increasing role of technology in terrorism. The reach of artificial intelligence can be perceived in every context, and it is not unknown in the context of terrorism. We can see that terrorist groups are using AI tools to produce believable deepfake content. They provide immersive experiences. They also produce better intelligence on targets and also produce believable tailored propaganda faster than ever. While this presents significant challenges for counterterrorism efforts, it also presents an opportunity for counterintelligence agencies to use AI tools to enhance operations and responses. That is only one of the highlights that this year's report has. But what else can we expect from the 12th edition? We see that terrorism remains a persistent global threat. Certainly, we can also see a set of the usual suspects of terrorist groups, such as the Islamic State. Yet we can also see the expanding reach of other groups, driven by political changes, geopolitics, and also social phenomena. Also, we see the increase of lone wolf terrorism in the West, characterized by rapid online radicalization and minimal external communication, making detection more challenging. However, I will not relieve any further as we are here today with Thomas Morgan, who is the Chief Research Officer at the Institute for Economics and Peace. He will present the key findings and trends of the 2025 Global Terrorism Index in further detail. Thomas is the lead researcher on the Global Terrorism Index as well as the Global Peace Index. In 2013, he was a visiting researcher at the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Institute at the University of Oxford. He holds a Master of Data Science from the University of Adelaide and a Master of Economics from the University of Sydney. Tom, thank you very much for joining us today, and please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Maria, so much, and thank you for participating in this event again, and really looking forward to the presentation and the discussion that we're going to have today. Just going to share my screen and just checking that everyone can hear me okay, Maria, the microphone's coming through clearly? Fantastic, great. Okay, and we can see the presentation in presenter mode there? That's all good? Fantastic. Okay, well, thank you everyone for joining us today for the launch of the Global Terrorism Index. So the presentation today will aim to go for around 30 minutes. So we're hoping to leave as much time as possible for discussion and questions at the end of the presentation. So just to start with a little bit about the Institute for Economics and Peace, for those of you who are not familiar with our work. So the Institute for Economics and Peace, we're an independent, not-for-profit think tank. We're dedicated to building a greater understanding of the key drivers of peace, as well as identifying the economic benefits that increased peacefulness can deliver. We operate from many different countries around the world. We're headquartered in Sydney, Australia. That's where I'm speaking from today, and that's where the bulk of the research and comms and partnerships teams are located. But we also have offices in Nairobi, in Brussels, in New York, Mexico City, and currently in the process of opening a new office in the Philippines. We produce many different major research reports. So we're probably best known for the Global Peace Index, which is released in June every year, which gives a snapshot of the state of peacefulness around the world. Then, of course, there's the Global Terrorism Index. We also produce an ecological threat report, which focuses on ecological threats, climate change, and the relationship with conflict. And then we also produce a number of other more specific and tailored reports. So we have a Mexico Peace Index, which has been running for over a decade now. And most recently, we released a report on geopolitics and peace, looking at trends in geopolitics. So the Global Terrorism Index, it sits within that. It's one of our major launches that we do every year. So I think the best place to start is with a little bit of the discussion around what exactly the Global Terrorism Index is, because we often have questions related to how the index is calculated, and then more fundamentally, what is the definition of terrorism? What does that include? What does that exclude? So we usually get questions on that, so we'll start there. So in terms of the methodology, the definition of terrorism we use, there are, of course, no one set definition of terrorism. Many different organizations have slightly different definitions, but you tend to find that within all those definitions, there is a lot of overlap. There is a consistent set of features by which terrorism is usually defined. So the definition that we're using, it has to be the systematic threat or use of violence. It has to be by a non-state actor, whether acting for or in opposition to established authority. The act has to have the intention of communicating a political or religious or ideological message to a group that's larger than the targeted group. And it must aim to generate fear and so alter the behavior of the larger group. So those are the criteria that each of the events in the database has to meet in order to be counted as terrorism. Now, so what does that exclude? So that excludes all forms of state violence. So if you're thinking about state-sponsored terrorism, state terror, that is not captured in the GTI. That's captured in other indicators, other indices we have. So something like the political terror scale, that measures state-sponsored terror, state repression of its own people. This also excludes organized criminal activity. So if you're looking at the kind of activity you've seen in Haiti or for example, the cartels in Mexico, even though it is looking to inspire fear, because it doesn't have that ideological component, it's not counted as terrorism. Now, there are a number of different sort of edge cases where sometimes it may be counted as terrorism, sometimes it may not be, just depending on the specifics of the attack. So I think the two most prominent examples here are attacks on military targets in a conflict setting. So as we will talk about later in the report, 96% of all terrorist attacks occur in a conflict setting. So there may be a situation in which a group is an armed extremist group, sometimes conducting terrorist attacks, sometimes conducting more straightforward military operations. So it depends on the specifics of the attack. The other particular boundary case is a mass shooting. So for example, if you have a mass shooting, somebody is killed, lots of different people in a single attack, sometimes that will be classified as terrorism, sometimes not. Sometimes it can be very difficult to discern what the motivation of a particular mass shooter is and whether there's an ideological component and so on. So when we've looked in the past at sort of mass atrocity attacks, mass shootings, tend to find that around 40 to 50% of those end up being classified as terrorism. So that's about the definition. Then we'll move on to how the index is calculated. So obviously there are many different aspects of terrorism that we want to include. The data source that we use is a media event data source that goes through media events and codes each of them based on those 4 criteria. It's by an organization called Dragonfly. It's called Terrorism Tracker. So that's the source of the data that we use. We then weight the different events based on the impact. So the 4 types of sort of components of an event are the incident, the number of injuries, number of deaths, and the number of hostages. And those are combined to give each incident a score. We then want to take into account the lingering psychological impact of terrorism. So a terrorist attack has an impact in a particular year, but then it can have impacts on society that last for many, many years. So we use a 5-year weighted average for each event. And then we want to take into account the fact that the impact of terrorism differs depending on the level of terrorism within a country. So if you have a relatively peaceful country with not much violence, not much terrorism, then a single terrorist attack can have a larger social and psychological impact than in a situation where you have a country which has hundreds of attacks every year. They don't have quite the same psychological and social impact. So we transform the scores to reflect that. So that's why when you look at the terrorism index scores, they're scored from 0 to 10, even though the country with a score of 10 may have thousands of times more deaths and attacks from terrorism. So that's how we calculate the index. So to give you an example of how this works, here's the map of terrorist attacks in 2024. As you can see, the majority of attacks are situated in South Asia, in the central Sahel region, some attacks in South America, some in Europe, So that's the raw data. The size of the red dots there is scaled according to the number of people killed in the attack. The ones circled in black were the 10 largest terrorist attacks in 2024. So when you take that data over 5 years and you apply all the different criteria that we talked about, this is what the map ends up looking like, which gives you the map of not just a count of deaths from terrorism, but the impact of terrorism. So those countries in darkest red had the largest impact of terrorism over the last 5 years. So that's what happens when you transform the raw data into the index scores. So moving on to talk about the index this year, the results and the trends and what we've seen, what are the areas of particular concern. So for the overall key findings, we found that deaths from terrorism, there were over 7,500 deaths from terrorism in 2024. That is a decrease from the previous year, but when you remove the impact of the Hamas attack in Israel in 2023, then you see roughly about the same level or number of deaths from terrorism in 2024 as in 2023. There was a slight decrease in the number of attacks, so 3% fall. Perhaps one of the more troubling things is that number of countries with a recorded terrorist incident increased quite significantly. So from 58 countries recording an attack in 2023 to 66 countries in 2024. So the overall spread of terrorism is increasing. When we look at the score, the index score, we find that 45 countries deteriorated and 34 improved, which is one of the highest number of countries deteriorating on the index we've seen since we've been doing the index. And as mentioned before, 98% of terrorist deaths occur in a conflict zone. And that's particularly important to note because there are currently more conflicts active in the world than at any time since the end of World War II. So if we know that conflict is associated with an increase in terrorism, this increase in the overall number of conflicts is particularly troubling because it suggests that there's a high potential for an increase in terrorism if those number of conflicts stay high. When we look at specific areas of concern, we find that the 4 deadliest terrorist groups killed 11% more people in 2024 than in 2023. One of the stories that's perhaps been a little bit under-remarked upon is the increase in terrorism in Pakistan. Pakistan has consistently one of the highest levels of terrorism since we've been doing the index, and that's only increased further in 2024. So the TTP in Pakistan had the highest increase in deaths, so a 90% increase in deaths in 2024. We also find when we're looking at the West that now that there are 7 countries in the West that are ranked in the 50 countries with the highest impact of terrorism, which is quite unusual when you look at other indices of violence and conflict. You look at something like the Global Peace Index, that's not something that you see. So compared to other forms of violence, terrorism has a relatively high impact in the West. We know that of those attacks in the West, 93% of all those fatal attacks in the West were carried out by lone actors, which is something we'll talk to a bit in more detail later in the presentation. We know that lone actors are 3 times more likely to be successful in carrying out an attack than a group. Specific groups, Islamic State and its affiliates remain the world's deadliest terrorist group in 2023, and IS and its affiliates are active in 22 countries. So we'll talk about that more in the last part of the presentation. And then we have a particular focus on the Sahel. The Sahel is the region most impacted by terrorism. It accounts for over half of all deaths from terrorism now, so 51% of terrorist deaths occurred in the central Sahel region. We find that there's a story around geopolitics there. So we have the withdrawal of the central Sahel states from ECOWAS. We have the waning of American and French influence in particular in the Sahel. Burkina Faso is the country that's most impacted by terrorism, even though it, over the past year, recorded a 21% drop in deaths from terrorism. And when we look at the distribution of terrorism in terms of the concentration of deaths, it's highly unevenly distributed. So 1/5 of all deaths from terrorism were in Burkina Faso alone, so over 20%, and then followed by Pakistan and Syria. And then Niger and Pakistan had the largest specific increases in the number of deaths, so 94% and 45% increase respectively there. Okay, so if we look at the 10 countries most impacted by terrorism, again, Burkina Faso remains the country most impacted by terrorism, which is quite a change from when we started doing the index a decade ago. So Burkina Faso is the only country other than Afghanistan or Iraq, which has been ranked as the country most impacted by terrorism. I think the other thing to note from the top 10 here is that 6 of the 10 countries are in sub-Saharan Africa, which really reflects the shift in the epicenter of terrorism from the Middle East and North Africa down into sub-Saharan Africa. Then we look at the distribution of deaths from terrorism. As I said, highly unevenly distributed. So 20% of deaths from terrorism occurred in Burkina Faso alone. And when you look at the 10 countries with the highest number of terrorist deaths, they account for 86% of all deaths from terrorism. So even though there were 66 countries that recorded at least one terrorist attack in 2024, the majority of those are smaller attacks, not resulting in many deaths, attacks on infrastructure and so on. When we look at terrorist deaths, highly concentrated within a select group of countries. So when we look at the increase from 2023 to 2024, the most striking finding here is the increase in deaths in Pakistan and the increase in deaths in Niger. So when we look at Niger in particular, that's a story we'll return to later in the presentation, but it's really about the sort of shifting geopolitical climate in Niger after the recent military coup. So you have a removal of French influence, a removal of American influence from Niger, a shift towards increasing Russian influence. And as you had that increased uncertainty, as the governing authorities in Niger shifted from their focus from one country to another, then there were opportunities for violent armed extremist groups to exploit in the uncertainty around that changeover period. And that's the predominant explanation for why you see the increase in deaths in Niger. When we're looking at increases in deaths in Iran and Russia, that's related to specific attacks. So both Iran and Russia had one very large attack each, which killed a high number of people, which is responsible for the majority of the increase there. When we're looking at the increase in the DRC, there's actually been an increase in ISIL-affiliated activity there. And even though it's not reflected in this chart, just last month, there was a terrorist attack from a group in DRC, which killed 65 people, that group affiliated with IS as well. So that's, again, another worrying sign is kind of the shift, not just in the Sahel, but in other countries in sub-Saharan Africa in terms of increasing impact of terrorism. So when we talk about the trends in terrorism that we've seen, so we have data from the index for 2007 onwards, and we were able to then, because of the 5-year weighted average, calculate index scores from 2014 onwards. So over the past 5 years, we've seen that the number of deaths has sort of fluctuated within a narrow band. So between sort of 6,800, 7,400 deaths from terrorism. So not a huge increase or decrease over the past 5 years. It's remained fairly consistent. The largest increase in the impact of terrorism, Burkina Faso, Niger, and Pakistan. In terms of the largest improvements, so countries where terrorism has reduced, Afghanistan, Iraq, and Somalia recorded the largest falls in the impact of terrorism. So with regards to Iraq, where we saw so much of the terrorism from sort of 2007 to 2011, there's actually been a 99% reduction in deaths from terrorism, which is perhaps the most striking example of the impact of terrorism falling. In Afghanistan, the fall is because the Taliban came to power, and so then because it's then the governing authority, the violence that is carried out is then not counted as terrorism. So that accounts for the significant reduction in Afghanistan. In the West, we saw that there was a large surge in terrorism in the mid-2010s. It's been falling every year since then, since the peak in 2017. However, we have now again seen a spike in terrorist activity in the West, and we've seen, of course, just in 2025 alone, several vehicle attacks in Germany, in the US, and so on. So that's another worrying trend. And we've also seen that anti-Semitic and Islamophobic incidents have surged since the start of the Gaza war. So in Europe, Australia, and the US, very significant jumps in the number of anti-Semitic attacks and incidents. So yeah, to give the specific figure there, in the 2 months since the start of the Gaza war in the US, if we look at the FBI hate crime data, we saw that anti-Semitic incidents up over 270% in a single month alone. So when we look at trends in deaths by terrorist group, we find that Islamic State was the deadliest terrorist group of 2024. Just a note on that particular figure there for IS, that is the combined figure for IS and all of its affiliates. So that includes sort of the Khorasan chapter of Islamic State, includes IS Sahel, IS West Africa, and so on. So we combine all of those into a single number there. The group with the second highest number of terrorist deaths in 2024 was JNIM, which is the group which was formed out of the merger of AQIM, so it formerly is sort of an Al-Qaeda affiliate, operating essentially only in the tri-border area of the Central Sahel, so the border area between Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso. And so that was the second deadliest terrorist group in 2024. You can see there for JNIM the significant increase since 2017, which really reflects the period in which the violence levels in the Sahel increased significantly. When we look at the trends in deaths from terrorism from 2007 to 2024, so again, we have a focus, quite a strong focus on the West, because the attacks in the West receive a lot of media attention, perhaps sort of a disproportionate amount of coverage. But if you look at the maroon bar in the chart, you can see when it comes to total deaths, that accounts for a very small percentage of total deaths from terrorism. The big increase, as I said, is in the Sahel, which now accounts for over 51% of deaths from terrorism. The big decrease in Iraq. So if you look in 2007, Iraq accounted for well over 50% of deaths from terrorism, and now only a very small fraction of those deaths take place in Iraq. Okay, so we'll talk about now 3 different special focus areas of the index. So the first one is on homegrown lone wolf terrorism in the West, then we'll look at the Sahel, and then we'll look at the particular activities of Islamic State and ISK in particular. So the first one we'll talk to is the rise of homegrown lone wolf terrorism in the West. What we find is when we're looking at the data we have, only 8% of attacks in the West were carried out by a specifically identifiable terrorist group. We also find that when it comes to radicalization, it's more rapid now. So there's limited data on this, but the data that does exist shows that the average time that it would take somebody to be radicalized and to move towards carrying out a terrorist attack in 2002 was 16 months. By 2015, that had fallen to 10 months. And now we find even that there are, not every case, but in some specific cases, we find people being radicalized even in weeks, not even months. So that's the time frame that we're dealing with for some specific attacks. When it comes to sort of modeling, why does this radicalization happen? Why do you see this growth in extremism? We find people that are isolated, disaffected from society, often find it's associated with mental health issues, a lack of meaning and purpose, a kind of feeling of alienation from their parents' culture or the surrounding culture more broadly, and lack of opportunity as well, lack of economic opportunity. The number of potential avenues for radicalization have increased. So of course, there's a lot of focus and attention paid to social media, but it's not just on social media. It's on fringe forums, encrypted messaging apps, on the dark web. Even there have been some terrorist organizations which have created their own sort of clones of popular computer games to simulate terrorist attacks. The number of attackers who are very young is increasing. So the number of those who are aged under 18 was 42% of terror suspects in the UK, according to the UK Home Office, and perhaps around 20% in Europe more broadly. So very, very young people becoming radicalized very quickly. Which means it's very difficult for intelligence agencies to uncover and stop these plots. When people become self-radicalized, when they're acting alone, they have a minimal footprint. There's no or less communication, so it's possible to intercept. It's happening on a very short timeline. There's necessarily not any terrorist financing, which can be traced and that kind of thing. So it makes it very difficult for intelligence agencies to track. So this is start by just giving a little bit of summary of terror in the attacks in the West by motivation for 2007 to 2024. So the different attacks in the database are coded according to different underlying ideologies. So whether it be political, religious, a mix of nationalist, religious sentiment, nationalist, single interest groups. So that tends to be, say, extremist environmentalist groups, or undetermined. So you can see there the number of attacks peaking in 2017. The thing to note here is the rise in attacks which have an undetermined ideology. So where it's difficult to ascertain exactly that there is a clear ideological motivation of sorts, but it tends to be confused or mixed. The second chart now looks at attacks in terms of whether the perpetrator was associated with a group, associated with a broad ideology, or whether it's unknown. So when we're talking about a group here, it's whether an attack is carried out by someone who is working specifically with or for a group like JNIM. When we talk about it being ideologically coded, what it means there is the attacker has an affinity with, say, far-right extremists or far-left extremists. but isn't actually actively involved in a specific group. And then the unknown is where it's just simply they have a mix of ideological messages. So we see that the vast majority of attacks that are carried out in the West, the attacker is not associated with a specific group. And then if we look at those as the number of attackers who are lone wolf rather than a group, so this is where you have somebody who is acting alone. In some circumstances, they may have very limited contact online with members of another group, or they may be encouraged to radicalize or encouraged to carry out a terrorist attack by a member of a known group. But essentially, the process of radicalization is done themselves. So again, you can see here the percentage increasing in terms of the number of lone wolf attacks, number of lone wolf actors. So looking around 2007, 2008, it was a small percentage. By the time we get to 2024, essentially all fatal terrorist attacks in the West are carried out by lone wolf actors. And this is particularly troubling because lone actors are much more likely to be successful in their attempts at carrying out a terrorist attack. So this data comes from a data set called the Jihadist Plots in Europe. So it's looking at the period 1994 to 2021, a very detailed data set which codes. And the advantage of this data set is that it looks at both successful and foiled plots. It's often quite difficult to gather data on foiled terrorist plots. So when we look at that data, when you look at attacks carried out by a group or planned by a group, only around 25% or so of those were successful. They were able to be carried out to the launching of a terrorist attack. When you look at those by a single actor, much higher success rate. So you're looking at around 60% of attacks carried out by single actors are likely to be successfully carried out rather than being foiled by intelligence agencies. So that's why the rise of lone wolf terrorism is so concerning. It's the speed of radicalization and it's the difficulty of intercepting these kind of attacks by intelligence agencies. So the second special focus area that we're going to look at is terrorism in the Sahel. And so we've already talked a lot about this so far. That's why it's such an area of particular focus, just because of the very high levels of terrorism that are occurring. As mentioned before, the Sahel accounts for 51% of deaths from terrorism in 2024. And really the most striking feature in the past year, in particular, so terrorism in the Sahel has been rising since 2017. It's the particular area of focus in the last year is the shifting geopolitical environment. So we find that Western and African influence, so in terms of the three Central Sahel countries withdrawing from ECOWAS, the withdrawal of UN missions from the Central Sahel region, the withdrawal of French forces, we really see that decline in Western influence. We see, conversely, very high increase in activity by Russia in terms of providing military aid, security aid, and then also growing Chinese influence in the region. Now, the influence of China is far less security focused, much more economically focused, but it is also growing considerably. We find there's a number of different issues which are driving the increase in terrorism in the Sahel. So we have a lack of state capacity and poor governance, particularly in the border areas. So a lack of the ability of the state to provide security for its citizens. We find conflict between farmers and pastoralists, which is then sort of folded into or subsumed into a broader jihadist narrative. So particularly after the end of the Libyan civil war, that really sparked a lot of the conflict in the Central Sahel region. And so you find what were smaller ethnic grievances, ethnic conflicts become part of a broader jihadist narrative. There are also concerns around ecological threats, ecological degradation, climate change, increasing the likelihood of conflict. And then, of course, you have various geopolitical interests as well. There's also a significant resources in the Central Sahel. So you have a very high number of gold mines. 7% of the world's uranium is in Niger. 25% of Europe's uranium supply comes from Niger. So when we look at attacks on gold mines, they've increased 300% since 2020. So that's just another complicating factor, which increases the risk of violence and terrorism in the Sahel. Terrorism deaths up over tenfold since 2019. JNIM is by far and away the most active and dominant group in the Central Sahel. IS Sahel and IS West Africa have not been as prominent, but what you find there is that there's often shifting alliances. So you often have conflict between JNIM and state security forces, ISWA and state security forces. You have JNIM and IS competing with each other for territory, sometimes fighting, and then even isolated reports of JNIM and IS working together on occasion. So there's a real shifting network of targets and alliances and so on, which makes the security situation in the Sahel so complex. And the particular concern in the Sahel over the last couple of years has been the potential spread of that terrorist activity elsewhere into West Africa, coastal West Africa. So we find that in Togo, for example, there were 52 people killed in terrorist attacks in 2024. There's also an increasing number of attacks in the border areas of Benin, Ghana, Togo as well. So there's a concern there, even though the number of deaths remains relatively low, that you'll see that violence starting to spread elsewhere into West Africa. So that's potentially the most important security concern over the next couple of years. So when we look at deaths from terrorism in Sahel, you can see that, again, increasing percentage of the total, also an increase elsewhere in sub-Saharan Africa. So when you look at the relative increase in sub-Saharan Africa, excluding the Sahel, over 100% increase since 2007. So mostly concentrated in the DRC, in Mozambique, but a number of other countries as well. When we look at where exactly this violence is happening, so it's almost all occurring within the tri-border area, where the governing authorities have the least control. That's where the vast majority of terrorist activity in the central Sahel is occurring. And so, as alluded to before, the major story here is around, in the last year, the change in political influence and geopolitical sort of alliances within the region. So we have a data set that looks at sentiment in media reports. And so what we find over time, so this is the Sahelian countries, their attitude towards France and the attitude of France towards Sahel. Now, obviously, there's a long and complex colonial and imperial history here in terms of France's involvement in central Sahel, dissatisfaction with those countries of the actions of the French government. But that's really started to increase, particularly over the last 3 years. So we see the number of negatively coded media stories in terms of the attitude of Sahelian countries towards France, going from around 10% in 2016 to over 50% by 2023, which really reflects, growing negative attitude towards France, waning influence of France in the region. Conversely, we see an increase in positive attitudes towards Russia. So as Russia has become much more involved in the situation in the central Sahel, attitudes of citizens in those countries towards Russia has increased considerably, positive attitudes. So I think that this is the chart that shows shifting attitudes towards the US and Russia. I think the thing to note here is that, again, looking at the 3 central Sahel countries, so Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, 3 countries where attitudes towards the US all became more negative over the past 5 years, all countries where attitudes towards Russia became more positive over the last 5 years. So it gives you a little bit of a snapshot of changing attitudes related to the geopolitical situation in the Sahel. Okay, so the last focus area that we'll look at is around Islamic State and particularly the activities of ISK. So I'm conscious of the time and looking to give people as much time for questions and answers as possible. So we know that IS, if you include all its affiliates, was the deadliest terrorist group in 2024. So over 1,800 people were killed in terrorist attacks carried out by IS. But that's just attributed attacks. So we know in the data set, there's a high percentage of attacks that are unattributed. For whatever reason, you don't have a group claiming responsibility. It's not possible to say that that attack was definitively carried out by this particular group. What we developed was a machine learning model which takes the characteristics of those unattributed attacks and looks at where they occurred, the time in which they occurred, the kind of tactics that we use, the kind of targets. Using that machine learning model, that you can then attribute those unattributed attacks to a specific group. And when you do that, you find that the number of attacks which are more than likely or were more than likely carried out by IS increases considerably. As mentioned before, IS, so it operates a decentralized network of affiliates. So there's ISIL, but then also ISK, IS Sahel, ISWA. And so as a result of that, the other thing to mention too is that you often have lone wolf actors who will immediately before the attack pledge allegiance to Islamic State. So they may have been self-radicalized online, essentially acting as lone wolves, but they have a strong ideological affinity with IS. So as a result of that, you have IS conducted attacks in 22 countries in 2024, one more in 2023, and we'll look at the map of the distribution of those attacks in a second. We also find that, you know, we think of where these attacks occurring, historically in Iraq and so on, but it was actually Syria and the DRC which recorded the most IS-related fatalities. Now, Islamic State Khorasan chapter is the group that's the affiliate that's grown most rapidly, so active in 1 country in 21 to 5 in 2024. So historically, most of its activity has been in Afghanistan, but we find its increasing reach, most notably in Iran and Russia, is the most surprising development there with regards to ISK. And we know that in terms of where attacks were carried out, there are also a number of planned attacks as well. So IS-related attacks were foiled in Israel, Iran, Turkey, Germany, France, Sweden, and Russia. So the potential reach and scope of the group is considerable. So this is a map of where the different IS affiliates were active in 2024. So you can see in red there, ISK active all throughout South Asia, but also in Russia. Then you have IS Sahel, IS West Africa, active in the Central Sahel region, and then a number of different affiliate groups active elsewhere in sub-Saharan Africa. And you can see that IS is active, you know, as far south as Mozambique in sub-Saharan Africa. So this is the deaths attributed to Islamic State by country and regional grouping. So you get a sense of how affiliate activity has shifted over time. So you can see predominantly in 2007 to around 2017, the vast majority of deaths carried out by IS occurred in Iraq and Syria. But now, even though that proportion is still high, there's been a growth in almost every other region. So in the Sahel, in sub-Saharan Africa, in South and Central Asia. So the group is almost equally active in all these different regions now, rather than just being focused in Iraq and Syria. And so one thing that we look at in the report, and we don't have the time to go into in detail here, but potentially something for the talk about in the QA, is just the increasing sophistication of IS-related propaganda. So this is a chart of propaganda pieces, propaganda that was produced by ISK. So not only has there been an increase in the number of propaganda pieces, but the number of languages in which this content is produced is increasing. So in 2024, ISK was producing propaganda 9 different languages. And we see, and perhaps something again to talk about in the QA, is the rising impact of AI in the ability to generate that propaganda more quickly, to translate it into other languages, and to disseminate it more widely. So that's the end of the presentation on the GTI 2025. I'll hand it back to Maria, and just happy to answer any questions on any aspect of the report or on terrorism more broadly. Thank you, Maria.
Hi, Tom. No, thank you so much for such an insightful presentation. Certainly, this is an interesting edition, once again, of the Global Terrorism Index. And there are a lot of things to take on. So I'll also give a bit of time for our audience to start adding their questions. I see that we're starting to have more and more. In the meantime, while we start to get the audience to process a bit more and to decide what their questions are, and we select them, I'd like to focus once again on the role of technology and the impact that it has in the context of terrorism. We see that there is a lot of aspects that have been influenced. You mentioned, for example, that there are more opportunities for self-radicalization, and it can also happen faster now. Certainly, this is also due to the fact that there's more content. We can also be more influenced by algorithms in social media, etc. It also attracts more the youth because, of course, younger generations are more used to interact online and certainly know more their way. Well, yeah, certainly online. More opportunities for recruitment, and then also in regarding to operations, terrorist groups also have the possibility to target in a more sophisticated way. On the other hand, we also see that there's positive opportunities for counterintelligence and counterterrorism efforts, but certainly technology, and especially artificial intelligence, has been going faster than we have expected, and we now have to adapt in how it fits into the context of terrorism. So moving specifically into what my first question would be, let's focus a bit on narratives, specifically on propaganda and also counter-narrative efforts. So given the rapid advancements of artificial intelligence, how might we see terrorist propaganda evolve in the next few years? And how do you see the implications that this may have for the detection and also counter-narrative efforts? So looking at both sides, both for terrorist groups and also opportunities for counterterrorism efforts.
That's a great question, Maria, and really very pivotal over the coming few years. I would say, just as sort of a note of caution around the narrative around AI and terrorism, of course, because it's currently the big thing. There's a lot of attention, a lot of hype. So it's the kind of area that gets a lot of focus. In terms of assessing the exact impact of it, it's much more difficult. So we know, I mean, we saw in the last chart in the report there, the increase in ISK propaganda, for example, the number of different languages. However, when you look at the sort of the reception that, because ISK has also been producing propaganda videos using sort of AI video generation technology, that kind of thing, the kind of reception that it had and the impact and its success in increasing radicalization, I think perhaps it received more attention just for the fact that it was AI related. And there was also a little bit of some suggestion that it wasn't actually very successful at this stage. And obviously there are limiting factors in terms of how good that kind of video generation technology is. However, I mean, you can compare the situation to even just 2 years ago, AI video generation, and how far it's come in 24 months, extrapolating that out another 24 months, it's not hard to foresee that the quality and the speed at which that material can be produced is only going to increase. The question around sort of counter narratives and countermeasures, I think, is very important and a very difficult one, because I know that there are a lot of attempts around, countermeasures, counter radicalization, combating misinformation and disinformation. The problem, I think, there is that sometimes those kind of narratives, those kind of trying to debunk narratives, are not as compelling, because you're sort of working in contrast to an existing narrative around exploitation or some kind of struggle or so on, and so constructing a meaningful counter narrative that offers its own positive vision in opposition, I think, is very difficult, and something that a number of counterterrorism organizations are really struggling to have impact in that area. So I think that's, yes, a particular area of concern over the next few years.
Thank you so much, Tom. By the way, I also want to highlight that you're receiving congratulations in the chat. So again, thank you so much for your presentation. Moving on from that, let's focus now a bit more on some other emerging trends. So you mentioned during the presentation that political and religious attacks have fallen since 2017 in the West. And on the other hand, we see that there are more lone wolf attacks. Now, once again, like in technology and the advance that we have seen from it, seeing this trend, counterterrorism efforts must be adapted to fit into this new context. Because you also mentioned that it's becoming more deadly, or has been more deadly, this kind of attacks. So moving on from that and going directly into my question, how does the shift toward lone wolf attacks in the West requires further changes in intelligence gathering and counterterrorism strategies compared to addressing larger networked organization?
Great question. And I think there's one very prominent example of how actions taken by intelligence agencies need to change and are changing. So that's in relation to the Southport attack, Southport stabbing in the UK. So the particular individual who carried out that attack was referred to the PREVENT program in the UK, the Preventing Violent Extremism program, 3 different times. Now, there are several reasons why that wasn't acted upon. One is simply the sheer volume of the sheer amount of kind of threats that intelligence services have to focus on. So they have to, they have to prioritize. There's always going to be some kind of threat assessment. that notwithstanding, the reason why that a particular individual was not followed up on was because they couldn't find at the time an ideological motivation for his interest in violence. But I think from what we've seen from the presentation is that that aspect of radicalization can happen very quickly. So if you have an individual who is, has a particular fascination with violence, a particular interest in these kind of areas, even if there isn't an easily discernible ideological motivation, that's still something that has to be taken very seriously, still something that should be considered, a potential terrorist attack in the making. And my understanding is that that is actually the reform that has been taken as a result of the Southport attacks, a recognition that even though, that initially they couldn't find that ideological motivation in material, it's still something that has to be taken seriously. So there has to be a sort of growing understanding that because of these confused ideological narratives, you're not necessarily going to find somebody who is from day one pledging allegiance to IS. They may have an interest in different kinds of radicalization narratives. I know there was a young man, a teenager, I believe, from Australia who went to fight for Islamic State and then carried out a suicide car bombing attack, whose original interest was not in Islamic State, but in politics, in far left politics, and then came to see IS as the vehicle for making that kind of radical change. So there has to be an understanding here that there's this kind of mutability of ideological interests and associations, and that's something that has to be, accounted for by intelligence services.
Thank you so much. Following up on this thought of process, the GTI indicates that the lone wolf terrorism, mainly these kind of attacks, are typically carried out by the youth. So we have a question related to this in the chat. How can states disrupt or counting these kind of emerging threats where the youth is much more involved in this kind of, engaging further in terrorism and also becoming more radicalized? What can states do to disrupt this?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And to be honest, I don't think there is a clear answer because there are specific actions that intelligence agencies can carry out. So that's the kind of thing that we just talked about in terms of a recognition that the speed of radicalization is increasing, a recognition that there may not be a clear ideological motive initially, but there's only so much that intelligence agencies and states can do with the capacities they have, particularly if the number of potential threats increases. There's always got to be that sort of triage. There's got to be the threat assessment and prioritization. So I mean, always with IEP, our underlying framework comes back to the concept of positive peace. So those conditions that create and sustain peaceful societies. Now, that's not a short-term solution. That's a long-term solution. But if you're looking at the drivers of increased youth radicalization, so increasing alienation, increasing issues around mental health issues, those are not the kind of issues that can be solved by one particular policy. That's a long-term change that needs to happen. And of course, it's a very broad answer to say increase positive peace, but really you've got to be looking at those long-term institutional, social, attitudinal factors, which can reduce those number of drivers. So there are always actions that can be taken out in terms of increased monitoring of social media and so on. But if you're not getting at the underlying factors which increase the likelihood of radicalization and extremism, then you're always just going to be jumping from one thing to the next in terms of trying to solve the issue.
Thank you so much, Tom. I was actually going to touch upon this, certainly going back into the center and the main objective of the Institute for Economics and Peace, certainly focusing on positive peace and building resilience. We see a lot of interest regarding that in the chat because they ask how can local communities engage and also help prevent. Certainly we know that it is not only up to the state, but certainly up to everyone around us to continue contributing to building this kind of resilience, also preventing radicalization, detecting it quite faster, because when it happens within local communities, there's certainly a lot of networks focused on raising awareness about this, specifically about radicalization. So one part of this could be going back to that on how to build resilience more effectively. So another question related to this would be, how can local communities and also governments leverage strategic communication more effectively to build resilience against extremist ideologies and conspiracy theories, especially in times of crisis?
It's, again, a very good question. And I'm not sure I necessarily have a great answer to this, because I think it's a great unanswered question. And if you're looking for sort of historical examples or precedents of it happening, again, very difficult. Not necessarily related to terrorism and violent extremism in particular, but if you look at efforts to combat significant youth challenges in other countries in the past, one example is Iceland. So Iceland is obviously the country that's ranked as the most peaceful in the world. It's been #1 on the Global Peace Index every year since we've been producing the GPI. Now, a number of years ago, Iceland had a particular problem with youth disengagement related to alcohol consumption. And so they had a very successful intervention program related around youth participation in sports, increasing youth civic participation, giving teenagers a sense of meaning and ownership over their own lives and engagement with local communities. And that's one example, not related to the field of violent extremism, but where you did have sort of a very successful intervention effort. I mean, there are always going to be issues around teenagers finding their identity, attraction to ideologies, finding out where they stand politically, religiously, and so on. So that's one example I can think of historically that works. Now, obviously, that's happening in Iceland in a context with a country with already very high levels of positive peace and a very small country. So it's difficult to scale those kind of interventions, but perhaps that's the kind of effort that can be looked at by local governments, communities, and so on as a kind of exemplar for increasing youth engagement.
Thank you so much, Tom. That was an excellent answer, actually. And moving on from this topic, we saw a lot of interest once again, but we encourage to continue the conversation later on with the Peace Bot, since we have to cover other themes also in the Q&A. You mentioned also that we could expand a bit further on the ISKP. So highlighting how the global reach of this group, especially that it has also expanded so rapidly in such a short time, it was highlighted during your presentations. What do you think are the key factors that contribute to their ability to recruit and operate across such diverse regions?
Yeah, so I think that the last chart in the presentation is the key there. So the ability to produce propaganda in a number of different languages, really able to increase their appeal. So we saw from that chart the increase not just in the total number of propaganda pieces, but the number of languages that they're operating in 9 different languages. Because of course, Islamic State Khorasan chapter, started essentially in Afghanistan and was acting against or in opposition with opposition to the Taliban. But it carried out one of the most significant, one of the largest terrorist attacks in the past year in Russia, and then an attack in Iran as well. Number of different contexts. So it's geographically situated in an area which is very diverse cultures and languages. So as a result, it then has the opportunity to spread in many different directions. But the key is the ability to produce that kind of propaganda information, produce those pieces to appeal to people across a number of different contexts, so across those many different languages. So I think, and also the fact that there's a certain element in which members of IS will shift from different contexts. So what you saw in the aftermath of the Libyan civil war, but also in the aftermath of the Syrian civil war, is you have people with experience in IS moving from one context to another. So even though they might be defeated temporarily in one particular area, then that skills and knowledge can be transferred elsewhere. And the other part of this is just the attraction of IS as a transnational organization. So the fact that you have people pledging allegiance to IS, in the West, in Belgium, in Sweden, and so on, in Australia, they're not doing it with other groups because they don't have that kind of status, that kind of name recognition. So as a result, almost not quite by default, but if there are going to be new terrorist groups, new organizations, it makes sense for them in a way to be associating themselves with IS as a broader organization. So that is part of the reason why it makes it so difficult to stop, and the reason why you see different organizations popping up in all kinds of different contexts.
Thank you so much, Tom. Certainly, I think what we can see and take away from the presentation, I mean, which was, of course, I encourage the audience to look a bit further later on at the report in detail. But what we can take away from today's session is that certainly we see that terrorist groups have adapted. They are certainly evolving because they have this sense of adaptability. They also have an innovative aspect, and they also make use of the tools that are available now and how they can exploit them for their own operations. And on the other hand, this is something that probably states, well, governments specifically, also local community leaders, and anyone who wants to get involved in counterterrorism and these kind of efforts must also take away, that we must continue to adapt, to innovate with new approaches, and also make use of the tools that we have available to counter narratives, and also to make sure that we can prevent radicalization from the beginning, and then lead on with more effective counter-terrorist efforts in the long way. But certainly something that you mentioned in building more resilience and also preventing radicalization, this is a long-term investment. It's something that communities must be engaged in, and it's more comprehensive, and certainly all sectors must be involved in order to tackle this issue. So now, unfortunately, we will have to end the session for the Q&A, but thank you once again, Tom, for engaging so much and the presentation. This is, however, of course, not the end. We once again mentioned to you that the report is available online, and of course, you can visit it at thevisionofhumanity.org or at economicsandpeace.org to download it and look a bit further into these trends. Also, the Institute for Economics and Peace has an AI Peace bot, which is trained on all IP's research and can answer all your questions in case you have more that we did not have the time to cover right now. A last announcement is that certainly this presentation has been recorded and will be shared with all of you during the next few days. But thank you once again to everyone for engaging and staying for the Q&A and for the presentation, and also for engaging with us. Thank you, Tom, and thank you also to the Institute for Economics and Peace for this report and the presentation. Congrats on this product.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you so much for being our moderator today, and thank you everyone for joining.
Thank you.